So if you've been to Six Flags Great Adventure in the last couple decades, you will know that they have a safari attached to their park. It's a relatively unique experience for the park and certainly is a draw for many guests in the region. Of course, the safari right now involves guests taking a safari truck with a guide narrating the trip as you journey through the many animal exhibits in the park. However, it didn't always used to be this way. You see, in the 1970s, the idea of zoos kind of became a little unpopular around the country as people began to feel that the confines of cages were cruel and inhumane and that animals weren't given the proper amount of space to live their best life like they would out in the wild. Of course, now we know this not to be true, and that in fact, most animals living in captivity actually do live longer and happier lives than those in the wild. But nonetheless, that was the opinion that people held in the 1970s, and as a result, safari parks began to crop up around the world, allowing animals to roam freely while the people were confined to vehicles. In 1974, Great Adventure would join the trend and build their own safari, which they would go on to bill as the largest drive-thru safari outside of Africa, with hundreds of free-roaming animals in a naturalistic environment. And when they said drive-thru safari, it didn't mean that you got inside a truck and went with a guided narrator. No, you went in with your own car. And ultimately, this is the biggest difference that the safari nowadays in the park has from when the safari first originally opened in the park. However, there are a few other differences. For one, the safari was not included with your admission to Great Adventure. In fact, it was a completely separate thing, kind of like Hurricane Harbor is now, where you obviously don't get to just walk into Hurricane Harbor because you had a ticket to Great Adventure. It was a completely separate thing that you would drive up to, buy a ticket, and then go through the safari, and that'd be it. Nowadays, of course, it is included, and you just ride it as a ride in the park as opposed to having to pay separately for it. The safari would cover several hundred acres when it first opened, and would provide guests with a 3-lane roadway to traverse the safari. A common problem in the beginning of the safari, especially on summer days, was that car radiators would overheat because of the constant stop and go traffic, since people were stopping and watching the animals. So as a result, many of the safari employees would actually spend just as much time helping people whose radiators are overheated as they would actually tending to the animals. Initially, the plans were to have all the park's animals cohabitate in the same 450 acres area without any fences, so that way they could live the same way they live in nature. But of course, that obviously was not going to work, as many animals would not survive in such conditions because they have predators out there that would come and kill them. So before opening the safari, they wisely separated the park into 13 sections so that way our animals don't get killed. Those sections would include, but not be limited to, the American Plains, the African Plains, the Lion Kingdom, Big Bear Country, the Bird Sanctuary, the Australian Outback, the Tiger's Lair, South America, and Baboon Village. The American Plains section would be home to animals like elk and buffalo, as well as llamas. As pretty much all these animals were grazing animals, one of the biggest challenges for the safari was keeping the land covered with grass so that way these animals would have stuff to eat. Unfortunately, the land that the safari was built on had sandy soil, so it was kind of poor for growing grass. And unfortunately, even though they gave the animals plenty of hay and feed throughout the day, they still tore up the grass eating it throughout the day. So to remedy this issue, the park would build larger feeders that were not only shaded, but were also in positions where guests could see the animals more clearly. One of the most popular animal areas was the elephants inside the African Plains section. When the safari first opened, there were 29 elephants in the park, making it pretty hard to miss any of them. There were originally a lot of trees in this section, but the elephants quickly took care of those, snapping them like twigs and taking them down. Even though the elephants shared the African Plains section with rhinos and ostriches, all these animals usually just kept to each other's herds and rarely interacted with each other. So you may be wondering, well, since this is a drive-thru safari, how the heck are they going to keep the elephants off the road and preventing them from crushing people's cars? Well, initially, actually, the elephants had free range of their territory. There were no fences, there was no hills, and there was no moat or anything keeping them away from the road, except for the safari employees who were responsible for keeping them out of the roadway and away from the cars. Great Adventure would also strategically put a huge feeding station and pond right in the middle of their area, so that way the elephants would be encouraged to stay away from the guests. Of course, eventually, to prevent anything absolutely horrible from happening, they would eventually put up a fence and put the elephants as well as the rhinos behind gates so that way they could not get towards the cars. Speaking of the rhinos, they would also cause a lot of issues with the grass, as not only would they eat it, but they also destroy it just by stepping on it because of how heavy they are. As for the other animal that filled the African plains section, being the ostriches, they had zero fear and would constantly walk up to cars and passing vehicles. Many times they would just come to the window looking for food handouts, or they would just stand in front of the car blocking traffic for one or more of the lanes. As many of you might know, hubcaps were a standard feature of most cars in the 1970s. These reflective metal discs were like rolling mirrors for ostriches, and it was common to watch an ostrich admiring itself in a neighboring car's tire. Confused by what it was seeing, the ostrich would sometimes attack and peck at the hubcap thinking it was another ostrich. Other times the ostrich would just stare and turn its neck with the rolling tire. The ostriches would also help to provide some of the most memorable experiences for many guests, as for those stupid enough to open their windows and let the ostrich in, they would move their head in and look around and see if they could find anything worth eating. Many times the ostrich would poke its head in, see nothing of interest, and leave. Other times the ostrich would do something a whole lot more vile. Now, unlike most other sections in the park, the African Plains was actually split into two sections, with one section having the rhinos, the elephants, and the ostriches in it, and the other one having animals like giraffes, zebras, wildebeests, and other animals of the grasslands. The grazing animals in this area chewed on so much grass that they actually would have to restrict animals off to certain sections so a grass could grow back in others. Eventually, things would get so bad in this section that they would need to move all the animals out of the land and take a couple years for the grass to recover before bringing them all back. As for the trees in the land, we know that, of course, giraffes love to eat from trees, but sometimes they would get so anxious at getting at the trees that they would actually end up killing them. So in later years, the trees would have to have fences and wire mesh around them so giraffes wouldn't go in and eat their bark and kill them. Now, I mentioned earlier that this version of the safari was different than the one we have now in the sense that there is no safari truck, there is no guide, but actually there is guided narration for this one, as if you tuned into a designated AM radio station, you would get guided narration as you went through the safari, telling you information about each and every animal in the park. The way Great Adventure was able to broadcast this was through a wire that was embedded in the roadway under the center lane of traffic. At the halfway point of the safari, the animals went from grazers to carnivores with big cats and bears. To enter this area, cars had to pass through a set of gates that would make sure that no animals were getting out and only cars were getting in. The lions were the first of the carnivorous animals to be encountered in this section. Roaming freely throughout the area, they would have no issue getting close to the cars and being on the roadway. The next animal in this section would be the black bears, who would take it a step further and would actually sit on top of cars instead of just sitting next to them. The final major animal in this section was the Bengal tiger, who would often also walk up to vehicles and kind of sit next to them, but for the most part would actually just sit in the shade and kind of chill out. They'd be the most laid back of any of the carnivorous animals in this section. Now, obviously, as you can see in the video here, despite these animals originally being able to roam freely next to the road and whatnot, they were eventually put behind fences for safety purposes. However, separated from those carnivorous animals were the most dangerous animals in the safari, those being the cheetahs, the leopards, and the Siberian tigers. Knowing how dangerous these animals could be, Great Adventure wisely made sure that these guys were behind gates right from the beginning. Following this would be the Australian Outback section, which actually wouldn't open originally with the safari park and would be an expansion in later years, with the section being home to animals like kangaroos and emus. The final and probably most memorable section of the safari for most guests was the monkeys and baboons. Like many other animals in the park, the monkeys would have zero fear of the cars and would often climb on top of them and jump between them. They would also sometimes become destructive, tearing off wipers, antennas, lights, and anything else they could pull off. The monkeys would also sometimes jump into the back of pickup trucks and attempt to escape through the exit gate. But these safari employees did a good job of shooing the monkeys back into the park. However, rumor has it that they failed to shoo them away from the Bizarro track. Hey, yo, look, it's monkeys. Yo, hey, what's good, monkeys? What do you think? These guys are like chimpanzees or something? Yo, wait, what is that in the back? Is that a roller coaster? Yo, monkeys, get out of the way! Monkeys, move! Oh my god, they have AirPods in. Monkeys, move! Monkeys! No! Oh my god! So this was what the safari was like when it first opened. How about we flash forward to now?
In the shadow of roller coasters, New Jersey has had its own safari, complete with exotic animals, for 38 years. The decision to close the drive-thru safari has disappointed many, some of whom bring their kids from all over.
That's part of the reason people come here, see the safari. And I don't think there's too many other safaris in the area.
I think it's a shame. Yeah, I went on the safari when I was maybe 7. Have some good memories of that.
You don't get to do that every day. It's not often they have zoo animals in New Jersey.
The drive-thru safari would close in 2012 and eventually be added to the Great Adventure Park as an actual attraction. This addition would not only get through the drive-thru aspect of it, with everyone getting into a safari truck as opposed to driving your own vehicle through, but it would also help make Six Flags Great Adventure the largest theme park acreage-wise in the world. Although the safari is still a great experience today and is also free now with in-park admission, it is missing a lot of what made it special with the drive-thru safari that you just cannot experience with this guided tour in a safari truck. Whether that be an ostrich pecking at your window, a bear sitting on your car, or a monkey stealing your antenna, these are simply experiences that you can no longer get at the Great Adventure Safari Park.
It's sticking in a car! It's in a car!
Rich, it's gonna bite you. Oh my god. Oh my god. Stop.
Am I saying they should bring back the drive-thru safari park? Absolutely not. I mean, the fact that that thing ever existed is honestly kind of unbelievable. I know there still are drive-thru safaris throughout the country and throughout the world still that exist, but none were ever as big as Great Adventures. And the fact that it lasted so long without any super major issues happening with it is really incredible. But for those of us who did get to experience it, is certainly something we will never forget and something that will always stay with us, because that is something that you just can't really experience very often nowadays. So that being said, I'll see you all next time. If you guys have been to a drive-thru safari or a Great Adventures drive-thru safari, let me know what your experience was with that down below. I'd love to hear your stories because I know there's some crazy ones out there. And I'll talk to you guys all again next time.